I'm David Glenn Taylor, and this is the Voyagers Podcast. Let me take you for a brief moment to a place that I hold dear. I spend a lot of time underwater. My favorite way to explore the reef here in Maui is by freediving, holding my breath and diving down to the seafloor, hanging out as long as I can. In this way, you see all kinds of things you won't be able to see from just snorkeling the surface. And if you do this enough, you begin to truly appreciate how diverse and just how delicate these beautiful reefs are. You see little tiny fish and crabs and corals, all perfectly balanced there on the reef, like they've been for 1,000,000 years. Here's an amazing science fact. According to the EPA, coral reefs are among the most biologically diverse and valuable ecosystems on Earth. An estimated 25% of all marine life, including 4,000 species of fish, are dependent on coral reefs at some point in their life cycle. If you read the news, you know that things are changing. The ocean is getting warmer. In a place like Hawaii, you really see it happening in real time, up close. We've had major bleaching events here in Maui recently, which is the term we use to describe the corals dying from the water being too warm. Just in the last few years, we've lost so much coral. It's hard to describe. The reef needs fighters, people who dedicate their lives to defending this precious resource. And today, I want to introduce you to my favorite reef defender on Maui. Hannah Bernard is the co-founder and executive director of the Hawaii Wildlife Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of Hawaii's native wildlife through research and education. She and I work together often aboard the Kaikanani, our family's tour boat, taking guests out to snorkel the various reefs in South Maui and teaching them about how to minimize the impact that we visitors have on the ocean. And she has wisdom that you need to hear, that we all need to hear, and take to heart. So Hannah and I sat down recently to, as they say here in Hawaii, talk story. This is a very positive podcast, but I wanted to talk about some of the stark realities of what we're dealing with in Hawaii. And the main thing is, all politics aside and all partisan, especially partisan politics aside, there are some realities of what's happening with the reef and what's happening in Hawaii. And not doing a doom and gloom thing, but you've been staring at the same reefs for how long now?
29 years.
29 years. So you're literally a walking kind of science experiment in that you've seen, you've sat and watched the same coral heads and the same reef portions of the reef change drastically. When you go out into the reef right now, what's your approach? What's your mental, emotional approach to the reef? Like currently when you go out there, are you sad? Are you hopeful? Are you excited?
Yeah, I think all of those are good,
Right.
good adjectives to describe the way I feel now. I must say though, I think the way that I go out in the water is very much, it's like sort of a spiritual thing for me. It's like my place of reverence. That's my church. And I have always felt just privileged and blessed to be able to get into the ocean on a regular basis. And certainly getting to go out on Kaikanani twice a week for all those years, just an incredible gift. And I did and do, when I teach naturalists training, I help them to see that the privilege and the ability to get to be out there as often as we are, and for some of us like me, for 29 years, as often as we are, for as long as we are, we have the opportunity to keep records of the changes and to share these back. And maybe there's something that we can learn from all this, not just our own observations, but sharing our observations. So I certainly go into the water with a naturalist eye. So the observant eye. I'm always encouraging people who are naturalists to try to do record keeping so that you have like some kind of an understanding of a sense of what's happening over time. Sure. For instance, in 2014, we had a lot of rain. That year was the year that we had that population bloom of the black-lipped butterflies on South Maui and at Molokini. Literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these fish. In our fish ID guides, what we're seeing in the historical records is specifically that this species does not school.
Oh, wow.
They
Really?
don't school. So to see thousands of them together in these massive shoals and schools, it's like, okay, so we're seeing things that They're not recorded. That's not something that's typical and in decades of observing the reefs. And we'll see these things happening in one season. So these are the kinds of things, especially with changes through the climate change and the ocean warming, to that which both gets brought here on the currents, but that which is surviving through these big ocean changes, like the bleaching episode. I mean, we have the opportunity to make these records and to share this information. And hopefully this real-time type of sharing will assist us in possibly helping to save those that are savable.
When did you first come to Hawaii, and where did you come from?
The first time I visited, I believe it was 89, could have been 90. And I went to the Big Island for a visit and took the whole family. We went. My former husband was a Tai Chi teacher, so we were there for a Tai Chi retreat, and it was extraordinary staying in Kalani Honua, and it's part of the Big Island that has been changed significantly by lava flows and big changes. But back then it was extraordinary beauty. And then 6 months later, we came back and visited Maui, and that was it. That was it. I waited until I was 35 to visit Hawaii for the first time. As a California native, we can come to Hawaii so easily, but I didn't have that opportunity. I was traveling other places, not to Hawaii. But I guess I kind of knew once I came, that was going to be it. I wasn't going to be able to go back.
Right.
And sure enough, that's what happened. So came to visit twice in 1 year. And then a year later, we moved the whole family to Maui. Matt just fell completely in love and just deeply taken over to where I just wasn't happy. I couldn't feel happy. The sense of the impact of humans, even as beautiful places I lived in California, Mill Valley, Marin County, one of the most beautiful parts of California, but all the freeways and all the traffic and all the people, it just it made me feel like nature was in bondage. Here, nature was still breathing. You could feel the valleys exhaling at sunset. Literally, and I'm sure this is what happens to most people. They get here and they're just taken over by the power of nature.
It's funny because the first time I came here, I had just gotten married and I was 21 years old. I was a kid. And my bride, she informed me we had been married maybe a month, and she said, "Hey, we're going to the grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary at Christmas." And I was like, "Oh, great." And she says, "So we have to buy some clothes for you for Hawaii." And I said, "Hawaii?" And she goes, and it's funny. The weirdest thing was that I knew that her whole family lived in Maui, and I just didn't connect the dots that was a place that my body could go to. I could get on an airplane and go to Hawaii. It lived in the realm of fantasy and movies and paradise and that whole, the ukulele and the palm trees and everything. A few months later, I'm walking down Front Street in Lahaina and just in a bit of a dream, And I felt the same way, in that I had a hard time after that being other places. The energy that you felt here, especially being in the ocean. I mean, my jaw just hit the floor the first time I snorkeled, because it was literally like the day after we got here. We were on a trilogy boat out to Lanai, and we were snorkeling at Holopoi, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And so that journey for you became one of, would you call yourself an environmental activist?
I am. I think of myself as a marine biologist first and foremost.
Right.
But with my training, my roots firmly planted in the foundation of science, having been a scientist with National Marine Fisheries Service for the first 5 years of my career.
Right.
But what happened for me when I was working in that realm was the realization that we weren't necessarily able to help mitigate, even back then, the threats to the ocean were apparent in the late 80s. Really clearly, we needed to be more seriously active, like seriously active, to do some intervention to help protect the health of the oceans. And so I crossed over to become an environmentalist and think of myself very much as and identified as an ocean activist. I see that in print about myself here, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess that is true. And the truth is that I became that because of my foundational understanding of the precarious balance of this beautiful ocean that we get to live in all around us, and knowing that it needed help from us. So that's how the environmental side of me became activated. And it's informed by science. But all of those were sourced by love. When I was 14 years old, fell in love with the ocean because I lived on the coast in Pacifica, looking at the ocean. High school was Oceana. Our mascot was the sharks.
Right.
Tiburon was the name of our yearbook. I mean, we were, ocean people.
Yeah.
And when I was 14 years old, two oil tankers collided outside the mouth of the Golden Gate, and it was the largest oil spill at that time. I became activated at that age. Something just reached inside me, like the call to move to Hawaii, where I had to just go down and help. And I never had done this. Cut school by myself and hitchhiked down to the beach to participate in the cleanup had been launched by the community that I lived in. And so there was straw that was washing in. So straw was deployed all over the waters, and it was washing in and absorbing the oil. And we were raking the straw off the beaches and picking up the seabirds, and there were de-oiling facilities set up to try and save the seabirds. But it was love. It was just pure, it's always been pure love and fascination with the ocean. Getting to live in close proximity to it, it's a part of me.
That must have been, I mean, you said you were 14 when that happened? That must have been traumatizing for a 14-year-old, especially with all those animals, because I remember, I know I actually read quite a bit about that oil spill. I remember because Wally Hickel, who was the first governor of the state of Alaska, was the Secretary of Interior. And up to that point, he was definitely a hardcore pro oil development, pro oil, everything, pro resource industry. He went out and he flew an airplane. He was in an airplane flying over the oil slick, and he went from literally like being that person to all of a sudden like one of the more environmentally conscious secretaries of the interior that we had at that point, to the point where he ended up leaving the administration, the Nixon administration, because it just shocked him so much to see it. And ironically, the second largest, the largest oil spill ever, the Valdez Oil Spill in Alaska, was, something that he became a hardcore activist in as well, and working in that way. And every Alaskan politician, it has to be pro-resource development because so much of the economy up there is oil. But he became that real hardcore advocate for just for accountability on the part of industry.
That changed. You get crossed over. Isn't that amazing? And I think, that's what was happening back then. So that was 71. And this was the birth of the movement. 1970 was our first Earth Day year. And we saw all these major changes, and these incredible environmental laws became enacted all within the next 3 or 4 years.
Right.
And like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, Clean Air, Clean Water Acts. But one of the wonderful things that occurred out of those oil spills, those two massive oil spills that impacted the west coast of the U.S. that you and I are talking about, was major changes to the way the industry did business. So they started double lining the super tankers. Right. And they started putting the pilots, as you well know, how many people in your family ended up getting trained and piloting tugs to be the guides for those big ships going in close inside the Inside Passage.
And all good things. I mean, I think that one of the real kind of misnomers about people in terms of their misunderstanding of environmentalists and environmental activists is that very few of them, and I've talked with lots of them, both in Alaska and Hawaii and other parts of the world, very few of them are anti-resource development. I think they all kind of understand, they're all intelligent. Most of them understand the resource needs that our economies have and stuff like that. It's just they want accountabilities and built in. They want to do what it takes to make sure that these things are safe. And again, talking about you being 14, standing there, a 14-year-old is not going to have all the education and understanding to know what's going on, but you sure are taking that in. I mean, that had to be such an impact. If you can take us back when you were that age, at the end of the night, you guys have been working all day on the beach, you're going home. Are you crying? What are you going through dealing with all the animals and everything you're seeing there? I mean, when you were that young?
Yeah, I remember, I guess the most powerful memory I have is just the leaving. Is just the leave taking. I'm going. I'm called. I have to go. I don't know what I'm going to. I don't know what to expect, but I have to go answer this call. And so, yeah, I mean, there's nothing very glamorous about raking up oiled straw, certainly, and it's hard work. And of course, probably like most young people, I had an initial sense that I was going to help with cleaning up the animals, taking in and actually de-oiling birds and helping the birds. But the truth is, that is a type of work that they were reserving for trained personnel. So although that may have been one of my motivations, although it was just the calling just to go down and be there and just have to be there and do whatever I can do. And I think many young people get that calling. There's there's this connection to the animals, but then sadly, I think a lot of people do get pushed away because, it's well-meaning on our part, but not everybody can handle animals, and
Right.
nor should they.
Yeah.
And so it's just as important that we do that work of breaking the oil straw.
Right. Yeah. The unglamorous.
And unglamorous as that is. And so in a super fundamental way, I think I crossed into adulthood in that very day. It was just like so many realization about this world, and that it absolutely informed me to this very day. Living my life as a conservationist who tries to minimize contact with animals and minimize our impact on their entire habitat. So one of the things that's really been strong for me is the protection of habitat. If you really love wildlife, then you got to take care of the home of the wildlife that you love. And it can't just be all about, I love them so much, I want to touch them and pet them and take pictures with them. And it's all about me and my relationship with them. True love is really allowing that which you love to flourish in its own way, in the way that it is intended to. That's the biggest step into adulthood, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it really is. I was thinking about Valdez. I went down to Valdez. I got to work with some organizations that are in charge of essentially the accountabilities that were set up after the Valdez oil spill. And I got to work with some of those groups. We had the opportunity to go down there, and we were walking on a beach, and this is maybe just a few years ago. And we're lifting up rocks, and they're coated in oil. It's still there. And it's this substance that, taken out of the earth, is not it's not viable for any kind of even microbiomes, any kind of life on that beach. It kills, everything. It chokes out the life out on these.
So lethal.
This is out in the wilderness, and I was blown away by that just simple act of picking up a rock and seeing these just coated and greased in oil and going, how do we come back from that? How did California come back from it? I mean, have they? Right.
I think one of the biggest problems for that area, Valdez, was the type of habitat because of the rocky shoreline. California coastline, particularly up in the San Francisco Bay Area where those tankers collided. I don't know if the same investigations have been conducted like have been. I was actually on a panel that was evaluating the impacts of the Exxon Valdez on that environment. I think it might have been 20 years ago. Because it's continual. How do we see what the impacts of this kind of devastation to an ecosystem are? There are particular components of that habitat and the wildlife and the pot of killer whales that never recovered and never will. It's kind of like a metaphor for our time. I think of it as like with nuclear waste and our plastics in the ocean today. When I was growing up, it was the oil tankers and the oil spills that were occurring that certainly opened our eyes to the vulnerability of the nearshore waters, because we didn't get to see what happened way out at sea. We didn't realize how we can now, like the gyres of plastic in all of our ocean basins, these masses of soup of plastics are out there, but that we didn't know that. But we didn't know how much oil was being spilled out in the high seas. Although it is discernible, it can be detectable. But when it's near shore, it impacts humans so quickly and so deeply that we respond. So once we see something that affects our own health and well-being, we get more activated. And the hard part about things like the plastics, the microplastics and the nanoplastics in the ocean and in the food web is that only more recently are we aware of how that's affecting our own health. So we started getting involved with that, with cleaning up marine debris, our nonprofit Hawaii Wildlife Fund, in 2003, officially cleaning up the area down at South Point. It's the highest area of plastics and net piling up. It's an impact zone, and all the main Hawaiian islands have them, but that's one of the biggest. But we started to address that issue because it's a place where wildlife are affected. And as we began the work, the rest of the world began to wake up to the impact of plastics on the entire world, not just on coastal communities, but it's in the air. It's been found in air above the Pyrenees. Microplastics and nanoplastics are found in sea salt and beer and bottled water. So sadly, it's this technology that we've grown dependent on. The hydrocarbons, the oil, plastics are made from these same ancient fossilized remains. We're taking something out of the earth and synthesizing something new with it that we don't really know how to get rid of. There is no way for it to be sent.
I've heard a lot of scientists talking about how we have not developed a technology that can solve that problem, that within the next 50 years, it's going to become a major thing that governments are going to have to invest in, is actually innovation and technology that invents a new thing that allows us to go back and to start actually recycling plastics in an efficient and way that actually we can reduce waste, and we can take ocean plastics and not just make tennis shoes out of them and call it good, but we can actually start, completely reducing our entire use of that entire cycle. And it
turning
can
off
go down.
the source. That's
Right.
the hardest part. Turning off that dependence
Right.
it's almost impossible. And there have been so many articles that have been written recently. It reminds me of the tobacco industry, that they hid the impacts of smoking on human health and misrepresented the science about
Right.
the impact of smoking on human health for several generations. And the same
Right.
has been done with the plastics industry. That industry has purposely led a campaign to promote recycling plastic as if that's possible, as if we really can recycle plastic in a way that's non-toxic and is economically feasible. So again, it reminds me like this issue of nuclear waste, which is another hot button issue when I was a kid. What are we going to do with this waste? Well, the idea and the hope was eventually we would have the technology, we would know what to do with such highly toxic, deadly waste. And we don't.
We don't. So what you're saying is, and I know which article you're referring to. I think it was in the paper like last week, wasn't it? And they were saying basically that the hydrocarbon fossil fuel industry has been investing a lot of money in promoting the idea that plastic is recyclable. So because so much of their profit is coming through making plastics and providing hydrocarbons for the plastic industries. So when I'm feeling good about, I just made some eggs this morning and I took the plastic thing and I put it in my recycling bin in the garage, that makes me feel good. I feel like I'm doing something. When the fact of the matter is that that thing is going to go into a landfill. That's where it's heading. It's not actually possible right now to
Sadly, we don't have the technology to recycle. That type of plastic is not being recycled on Maui. And I don't think it's really being recycled anywhere, not with any kind of volume. And so, the article was extraordinary. Good piece of investigative journalism. I think it was NPR.
I'll put a link in the show notes for that.
NPR, I'm pretty sure. To interview those people within the industry who've been part of the campaign to keep plastics being created, they knew they had to make the public feel like, well, we can do something with them. It's okay. It's not as toxic as we think it is because we can recycle it. Conscious effort was made to mislead the consumer into thinking that we could do this. We can recycle plastics. And to this day, we're still wrestling with that. I belong to a coalition of conservationists and business people who are trying to figure out a way to recycle the plastics that we pull off our beaches. Here in Hawaii, with 90% of our goods imported, 90% of our food, I think it's more than that for all of our goods, but we're so dependent on getting things shipped to us. We're trying to reduce our carbon footprint. So with 60 tons of nets being pulled off our beaches every single year, Hawaii Wildlife Fund has pulled over 300 tons off our beaches since 2003. Wow. We're trying to think of how can we use this? Well, we've got to do something with it because we don't want to send it away and have it be on a ship and go somewhere else. Of course, China's not taking it anymore. So there's no place for it to go. But can we use it? So we've been talking with people for years about how to reclaim it. Well, the truth is the cost of sorting so many different types of plastics with so many different types of breakdown product that are in some cases more toxic than others, that have a lower melting point than others. So if you try to reuse them, you're going to release gases that are toxic, if nothing else. Or you're going to end up, maybe you want to cool something, maybe you're using water as part of the process, pressure, and water gets involved in pressurizing plastics to make them meld together. What do you do with that contaminated water? We're talking about nanoplastics and microplastics that are just floating in the ocean and in our air. And then we're going to take those big pieces of plastic and melt them down and make them into something else, and that there's not going to be some kind of a toxic gas or byproduct. This is the problem for our time. What can we do? Can we just landfill all this stuff? No, it's not the answer, but it's less toxic. It may be less toxic to landfill it than even to make something out of it. So we're wrestling with that because we want to make something out of it so that it gets harvested and turned into something useful. In another analogy, if we made something that was contaminated with nuclear radiation, we still wouldn't want to use that material. Do you know? So on that same level, we're looking at how do we do something with this?
We had a phrase in business called wicked problems. It was coined by a guy named Marty Neumeyer. He was an advertising and branding kind of guru working in Silicon Valley. And he would work with these giant corporations, and him and his firm conducted a survey of what they called wicked problems. So they talked to like 500 CEOs of all these major corporations, and they were saying, what are the wicked problems? And he said, by definition, a wicked problem is something that on the surface and in any kind of intelligible way, there is no solution. We cannot solve it. We do not know what to do. And that require, by definition, innovation in order to, right? So like what you're saying is we're talking to people for years, and with the hope that at some point we crack the code and that there is some kind of viable solution, because it doesn't seem to be one. And I have a person who's been working in this field for 30 years saying it doesn't appear right now. It appears that the most viable solution is to bury all the plastic we're making. Where are we going to put it? We're going to fill the Grand Canyon with plastic, or what are we going to do? Because that kind of seems like what we're doing in a sense. We're filling the oceans with plastic.
Problem. That is exactly what it is, isn't it?
Yeah. It's funny because this podcast is I started it and I was always like, we're going to make this a super positive. This is going to be a super positive kind of thing. And when I was talking to Maria about who I wanted to bring on, and she said, hey, you should talk to Hannah. I was like, oh, that's a good idea. My initial response was, oh, that's an awesome idea. Let's talk to Hannah Bernard. And because I find everything that you've been doing in Hawaii and being around you on the boat and everything has been fascinating. But then I immediately thought, oh, wait, Hannah's career is working on the wicked problems. That's not a fun conversation to have, right? Because I think a lot of the conversations we've had over the years, even just on the boat on the morning, have been about those problems. I know you were dealing with injection wells here in Hawaii, and you were all the way at the Supreme Court, talking. Were you in the room with the Supreme Court when that was being argued?
I was.
What was that like? I mean, first on two levels. Let's talk about the case second. But first, what was it like to be in the Supreme Court in front of those justices?
Yeah. Well, that was one of those life experiences that you sort of never forget. And it's a touchstone for me that gives this feeling of weight and power to both the work that is worthy. So you talk about a wicked problem, but there's also the worthy opponent as another concept. And that is, we have these opponents in our life and we are worthy of the battle that we're going to fight with them. And so in the sense that this particular case was so important and so groundbreaking that the pollutant industries saw this as an opportunity to weaken the Clean Water Act.
Introduce the case for us and tell us, for the listeners, what the case was and then and how it went down.
We learned that our injection wells, it's a hole in the ground where wastewater is pumped to dispose of it, that are all sort of close to the coastline as mandated by law so that they don't contaminate drinking water. But sadly, they contaminate ocean water. So we learned that the one in the Lahaina area was coming up, and a permit was about to be reviewed. So it was an opportunity for us to evaluate the power of the permit and see if it was worthy of managing the wastewater. There's a special kind of permit that issued for polluters. If there is pollution that is going to be emitted into an American body of water, then it needs to be regulated by this MPDES permit. So the permit allows for a certain amount of pollution, but it can't damage the ecosystem. And it has to have all these checks and balances within the permit that allow for monitoring so that the ecosystem isn't damaged. Well, we had a suspicion that this particular type of disposal process was damaging the ocean. It wasn't known for sure at the time. This is back in the 90s. So there were algae blooms occurring along West Maui. And one of the suspicions was that these injection wells, and there were 4 of them, the injection wells were leaching into the ocean since they were only about 100 to 500 meters from the shoreline.
Oh, I remember those algae blooms were unbelievable. I remember snorkeling off of remember the old Embassy Suites there? The Pink Hotel down in Kanapali? And I remember at 1 year I was there, and then the next year I go back and you couldn't see a thing. It was just the ocean was dense with it.
So in 91, I moved here. And then it was in about 1994 that they brought Dr. Wendy Wiltsey over from San Francisco, Region 9 EPA, to help solve the problem, to figure out why we had these algae blooms. And so I got to live and see and be a part of and professionally involved in this process from the beginning in addressing a big problem and trying to figure out how to solve it. So it took a long time, a lot of detective work, a lot of good scientific research. But after almost 10 years of research, enough information was beginning to come forth that was leading us to believe that indeed these injection well waters were entering the ocean. They were leaching in through the groundwater. And so by 2007, when the DLNR did a little white paper and they took it out to share with the public, that showed a correlation between these algae blooms and the injection wells, the 3 county injection wells in particular, Lahaina, Kahului, and Kihei. That's when those of us working in the marine tour industry and conservationists and people making their livelihood off the ocean, feeding their families off the ocean, we all became very concerned and activated and started looking at, what could be the culprit if these injection wells have this correlation and there's nutrients in wastewater that's like fertilizer feeding algae to overgrow. Gee, maybe there's a connection here. Sure enough, it wasn't rocket science. It was strongly suspected by the average person who loves the ocean and kama'aina of all ages that probably there was something being released into the waters, even if it's just fertilizers from our own waste. It's a pollutant in the ocean, and so enhancing the algae to grow. So all these great scientific studies started to initiate. And what was learned was that, yes, indeed, the wastewater was entering the ocean very close to shore, even within a few meters of depth in some places, and that it was filled with nutrients, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and pollutants like flame retardant and anti-seizure medication and caffeine, and you name it. If it comes through us, through our bodies into wastewater, that's detectable. And in fact, there are a couple of smoking guns, like there's a particular form of nitrogen, a stable isotope of nitrogen that comes in human poop, and it was found within the algae that were overblooming in that area, which is basically like a smoking gun. Yes, indeed, we have polluted ourselves and polluted our reef. Top of that, it was also found that the nitrogen was causing bioerosion, was actually eating the coral skeleton of the reef. So if you look at the places on the West Maui shoreline where the seeps, we call them seeps, think more like a fire hose of water gush coming out of the groundwater and into the ocean, that it's got like a dead zone around it. You can see dead coral. It looks like an explosion has occurred, literally like a bomb has gone off, and dead coral with algae growing all over it. The whole reef is not dead, but the places closest to these seeps are dead, except for the algae, which is benefiting from all those nutrients. So we began to have conversations. We started with community management and community involvement and community activism. We started talking to our outside collaborative resource people in the scientific community, former EPA attorneys, all kinds of people started to be our advisors to our communities and say, here's some things that we can do. First, we started with going to the EPA. And during that time, in the early 2000s, the EPA was very much an ally for us. We hosted 2 public meetings with the EPA here on Maui to share our concerns. And they listened diligently and took the information back and actually helped to modify some of the things that were happening at the Lahaina treatment plant, including the amount of fresh water going. They wanted that reduced, even fresh water alone, in a source that is not natural, but that man has created by creating this sewer between the sewage treatment plant and the ocean with using our groundwater as a sewer. This fresh water, even if it was completely cleaned of nutrients, it can kill the reef because it's more acidic. And so the fresh water itself was viewed as detrimental to the health of the coral. And the EPA asked the county to begin to reduce that dependence on the injection wells for that reason alone, not even to mention all of the toxic chemicals that were also the witch's brew inside of the wastewater. So as it turned out, we couldn't get as far as we wanted. Sitting down with 2 different mayoral administrations, 2 different mayors, our coalition created a couple of different groups, one called the DIRE Coalition, the Don't Inject, Redirect Coalition, trying to support the county, positively working with the county to use the water, reuse the wastewater on land and not pump it down into these holes in the ground. And so we didn't really get progress in 4 years. And at that point, many of us became very concerned that the reef we had lost already 30 to 40% of the coral cover. And we were worried that the reef was reaching a point of no return of health. We had to start talking about legal options. So I actually went to Earth Justice myself. I was the person who reached out to our attorneys to say, maybe we need to explore filing a lawsuit. And so our coalition joined together, co-plaintiffs, and ended up filing the lawsuit against the county in 2012. And so 8 years later, and two court wins. We won in our lower court, our Hawaii federal court, and then we won at the appeals court in San Francisco, the Ninth Circuit, and then the county appealed again all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The county, instead of fixing the problem and stopping the promise, and every administration promised they wanted to stop using the wastewater as waste and use it as a resource. They all wanted to stop injecting and redirecting, but very little of that actually happened, not enough. 4 million gallons a day going into the ocean, going into these holes in the ground that ended up in the ocean, which was proven, like I said, by all these different scientific studies and a dye injection study.
Right.
We actually have proven transit time. In less than 84 days, the dye is detected in the ocean after being put into our injection. There isn't any dispute that that water is going in the ocean. So finally, here we are, back to your question of how was it to be in front of the Supreme Court. We spent a year trying to keep from going to the Supreme Court, and we reorganized our coalition and tried to have the county withdraw the case, because it was the county that was pushing to go to the Supreme Court. Our mayor, our mayoral administration, our county council voted to withdraw the case from the Supreme Court. And that was extraordinary. They stepped into a very admirable leadership role where we had a majority within the council that voted to withdraw the case and settle at home once and for all. And we tried to settle. We had a settlement agreement. We wanted to settle the case. We never, us plaintiffs, never wanted to go to court. We didn't want to spend taxpayers' dollars in a court case. And the truth is, our attorneys still haven't been paid. The county has spent more than $4 million fighting this battle against its own residents to continue to pollute the ocean without a permit, the NPDES permit. So get to the Supreme Court, go through the process of being at the court. And for me, that was just incredible, because I've been to Washington, D.C. before, but I'd never been to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. And, what a beautiful building it is. And it's got so much power, and so many incredible decisions are made there. And our Supreme Court justices, their appointments are so deeply embattled and fought over by administrations, because their life-term appointments mean that their power is phenomenal in the final decisions that they render. And so, just to be in those chambers and to be there watching our attorney, David Henkin, argue our case, it was just a privilege and a moment in time and in my life that is one of those ones that'll go down like, okay, I just will never forget. Watching our case, the Hawaii Wildlife Fund et al. Versus County of Maui, get argued in front of the Supreme Court, and argued so well that since the decision was rendered in our favor, in the plaintiff's favor, that indeed the county was violating the Clean Water Act. There have been webinars, there have been many discussions about our case. Our lawyer, our David Henkin, has been lauded by professors and attorneys across the country for the way that he argued our case and the gifted nature that he had of arguing our case and persuading an overwhelming majority of that court, 6-3 decision in our favor. That's just an extraordinary win for us. I mean, even just to be there, had we lost, it would have still been quite the experience. But then to have won, a glorious feeling to see our courts in action and our environmental laws. That I was a kid watching these laws become enacted as a result of the things that we're talking about in this conversation. These pollutions that we created, and now we had our court case, which the polluting industries wanted us to lose so they could continue to pollute without any oversight. They want to pollute without oversight. Now, as you said earlier, environmentalists in general, the conservation community, believe in balance. Not too many of us think that there's a way that we're going to live as human beings and not utilize resources. We just want to do it in balance, and we don't want to destroy our home for future generations and kill off all the wildlife. So the desire to dismantle the Clean Water Act with our court case was clear. It's in the record. The parties that joined the county, that came in to support the county's position, were all it's just a laundry list of the polluting industries of the nation. that would stand to benefit if the Clean Water Act were destroyed, had our case been decided against. So, yeah.
Amazing.
That's why the wicked problem, it can be addressed, and it may take 12 years,
Right.
and it may take a lifetime, but it is the worthy battle. It's the worthy opponent that, we are here, if we live long enough, to witness the overturn of something that is unsustainable like that.
Right. Wow. It's kind of a Hollywood story of this 14-year-old girl witnessing this thing and then having an impact and send you on a path for your whole life in terms of your purpose on this planet. And to find yourself in front of the Supreme Court fighting this battle and then to come out victorious and to feel that's got to be amazingly satisfying. I don't know if all of us can relate or can have a personal story that is that full circle. Yeah. I guess I want to ask you, what'd you have to drink that night?
Yeah, so in this age of COVID, we got the decision from the Supreme Court the day after Earth Day on April 23rd. The court rendered the decision, and so we're all the co-plaintiffs, we're talking to each other, and we're having a virtual celebration. We're talking about the day, which still hasn't happened yet, where we can celebrate together. So the champagne hasn't flowed to the
not yet, huh?
We'd like it to, and the truth is the county is still not finished